My name is Anna Wilton. I work alongside Nat as the Assistant Director of Geopolitical Intelligence at Phalanx. So I tend to focus more heavily on South Asia. It seemed timely to talk about the geopolitical implications and some of the risk considerations for foreign businesses and NGOs that have arisen or are likely to arise as a result of the Taliban's takeover. Just before I get into it, I'll say I'm not going to talk at any great length about what the takeover might mean for jihadist activity, given that Nat's just covered it more eloquently than I would have. I'll mention it briefly in the context of key security risks, but that's about it. So of course, we'd both be more than happy to go into more detail about it at the end if anyone has questions that we haven't covered. Thank you. To kick off then, I don't think anyone here is likely to need a great deal of background information about the recent events because you will clearly have access to the internet, but to give a brief summary of how things stand, the green areas on the map to the right show the areas where at the moment the Taliban has more or less uncontested control. The vast majority of those areas that were previously under government control or contested have been captured since late June. Which is when the Taliban took over its first border crossing. And it went on to make a very quick sweep of other border crossings with Turkmenistan, Iran, Pakistan over the course of July. Having also made quite concerted efforts to encircle provincial capitals since about May, it then managed to make a very quick series of provincial capital takeovers between the 6th of August when it took the first in Nimruz province and the 15th when Taliban fighters walked into the presidential palace in Kabul. President Ghani left the country that day, so by the time that the Taliban took Kabul, it was more or less in charge of the entire country with just a few pockets of resistance left. The most notable of those was in the Panjshir Valley, which is still highlighted in yellow on the map there, because although the Taliban credibly claimed to have taken control of it on the 6th, regardless of resistance leaders denying that, it's still very much the stronghold of the resistance. It's an area that the Taliban never managed to capture during its previous period in power. And that's where we're seeing a lot of guerrilla activity now. The sort of resistance in its most organised form is coming from ethnic Uzbek and Tajik former warlords, also the former First Vice President Amrullah Saleh, and the son of the former Northern Alliance leader Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was based in Panjshir. So although the Taliban has largely taken control of that area, it's still a key source of guerrilla fighting, and that's likely to remain the case going forward. The other sort of particular area of rebellion at the moment is that blue area marked as contested in Balkh province. The governor there has been a very fierce critic of the Taliban for several years, and she managed to leave the country since the takeover, which was only confirmed yesterday. But she had been leading a very strong resistance against the group until that point. So as things stand, to all intents and purposes, the Taliban has control over the entire country. And having announced that it had captured Panjshir, it named what it's calling an interim government on the 7th of September. It is all male, it's very heavily Pashtun dominated. There are 33 members and only 3 of them are from ethnic minorities. Several of its key members are subject to international sanctions, including the Prime Minister and the Interior Minister. And it's entirely unclear what interim or caretaker government means in this context. The appointees are very senior figures. A lot of them, including the Prime Minister, had very close connections to Mullah Omar, previous roles in the Taliban government. They will have significant appeal to the most hardline members of the group, as well as to its core Pashtun supporters. Very important links to the Haqqani network in Pakistan. So in short, this setup seems very much like one that the Taliban would happily have in place permanently. And there's been no indication of what the kind of possible road to a changeover might look like. The one certainty really is that it absolutely will not happen through an election process. So regardless of the name, I think the assumption has to be that this setup is not being seen as a stopgap. And it's likely that this is the government that external players will have to deal with for the foreseeable future in some form. So as soon as the Taliban took over Kabul, there was a lot of uncertainty about what kind of approach to leading the country the group might take and whether it would return either immediately or over time, to a very strict interpretation of Sharia like it imposed previously, or whether it would possibly take a slightly less restrictive approach, albeit governed under all circumstances by Islamic law, given that its fundamental objective has always openly been to re-establish an Islamic emirate. Some of this uncertainty came from statements that the Taliban made shortly after it took power. So, for example, in terms of statements, we saw in the first press conference on the 17th of August, the Taliban spokesman making a commitment to respect women's rights, although that was very predictably caveated as being within the rights of Islam. He also said at that point that the Taliban would offer amnesty for former government officials. That was a response to significant and very credible concerns about possible acts of reprisal against them. There was obviously a substantial degree of skepticism over these promises and the extent to which the Taliban was likely to follow them, which is sort of evident from the huge queues at Kabul airport and the outflows of people from Afghanistan to neighbouring countries like Iran and the stands to the north. That skepticism in the very early stages was coming as there were actually some suggestions on the ground that the Taliban was being slightly more permissive than it had been previously. So it specifically encouraged women and government employees to go back to work in some areas. It talked about forming an inclusive government. Certainly its treatment of international NGOs, and that's including Western Christian NGOs that we'd expect to be sort of really key targets, was at least in the early stages quite cooperative. And that's most likely to have reflected an acknowledgement among at least the senior leadership that the group needs a level of international cooperation, given that, as Nat mentioned, it's extremely reliant on aid. And targeting international NGOs or conducting reprisal attacks on a level that would suggest a high-level directive was being followed would just absolutely torpedo its chances of receiving that or potentially accessing World Bank or IMF funding in the future. It also perhaps reflected an understanding that the international NGOs provide programs nationwide that are serving a purpose and would quite plausibly address challenges that the Taliban will otherwise have to address itself in the very short term, while its preference would be to be able to concentrate on consolidating control instead. So at least in the sort of immediate aftermath of the takeover, there was a relatively smooth transition in a lot of areas. It is clear that over the last few weeks, slightly more problems have been reported, including more harassment, more threats to aid workers and UN staff. That's something that the UN Special Envoy raised concerns about earlier this month. There have been also more cases reported of door-to-door searches or offices being forcibly entered and searched, documents and hard drives being taken. And I think the door-to-door searches in particular certainly give cause for concern, particularly given that during the takeover, the Taliban gained access to former government databases that contain a lot of sensitive information about military personnel and their connections, their relatives, guarantors that they had to offer when they came into service. And those could quite easily be used to identify sort of networks and personal connections of Taliban opponents. There have also been some credible reports of summary executions of former security force members, including from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So it's undeniable that that is happening on some scale. But for now, there's no indication that that's coming sort of in response to a high-level directive. So it's very unlikely that at this stage that it's a reflection of the Taliban's policy. And it's more likely to be an indication that there are kind of members of the rank and file who are taking a slightly rogue approach or trying to impose a more harsh interpretation of Sharia from the outset. Moving on then to look at some of the key geopolitical implications of the takeover. I think it's important to note that most countries, and particularly, but by no means exclusively, most Western countries, are very unlikely to formally recognise the new Taliban government as legitimate in its current form. This is very much a sort of victor's government. It's not been established with the aim of appealing to or appeasing external actors. It's been designed to minimise potential Taliban infighting, to appeal to Taliban hardliners and Pashtuns, to a very limited extent. It's perhaps intended to have a shot at minimising ethnic armed resistance through those very limited Uzbek and Tajik appointments. But the inclusion of so many Western sanctioned individuals clearly shows that winning support internationally was not the primary objective here. I think particularly because it had been quite widely rumoured that Mullah Barada, who had previously led the Taliban's political office in Doha and is seen as kind of, relatively speaking, fairly pragmatic, was a major contender for the Prime Minister's position, and instead he's deputy to Akund, who's been under UN sanctions for the last 20 years. So this isn't a government that most countries are going to feel comfortable with legitimising through formal recognition. And at least as of yesterday, no government had agreed to formally recognise it. Having said that, there are countries that cooperated with the Taliban to varying degrees before the takeover and are likely to be more willing to cooperate openly with it now, whether or not they go so far as to recognise it formally. Chief among those that have made it very clear they'll work with the Taliban are Russia and China. Both have said that they'll maintain diplomatic facilities and that they'll conduct business there, and the Taliban has reciprocated with statements, particularly about China, suggesting that it's going to be the closest business partner the Taliban has. In both cases, to an extent, that will reflect Russian and Chinese geopolitical considerations and sort of efforts to increase their regional influence, particularly relative to the US. Pakistan, similarly, although it's been more cautious in its rhetoric, at least, than China and Russia have been, has links to the Taliban, recognised the former Taliban government, and it will almost certainly be willing to cooperate to some extent, partly because of the potential commercial gains, partly to prevent India stepping into the gap that Pakistan could otherwise potentially fill, and partly in the hope of limiting Pakistani Taliban attacks on Pakistani soil, as Nat mentioned. Iran is another one, slightly tricky given the sectarian differences, but it has a level of connection with the Taliban. That's something that was clear, for example, when Mullah Mansour was killed returning from Iran. And there have already been some unconfirmed reports that the Taliban has possibly sold some captured US military hardware to Iran since the takeover. It's certain that the Taliban will be looking wherever it can to secure funding, because the World Bank and the IMF has suspended its access to funding. The US has frozen billions of dollars held in reserves for Kabul. So that's put it in a very difficult situation economically. The problems that total suspension of aid and funding will cause for Afghan citizens more widely mean that for humanitarian reasons, as well as geopolitical and security ones, there is going to be a level of cooperation even from countries that aren't willing to recognise the Taliban formally. The EU's foreign policy chief, for example, said at the beginning of September, before the government was announced, that the EU had plans to establish a sort of joint European Union diplomatic presence in Kabul, not in a sign of recognition of the Taliban, but because it would be necessary to support the Afghan population and to prevent Afghanistan becoming a safe haven for jihadists. The UN Secretary General has also expressed scepticism about the extent to which the UN can actually put any pressure on the Taliban over its sort of form of governance. But he has said that aid could potentially be used as leverage to kind of press the Taliban to protect basic rights. So I think that's likely to be another driving factor that ensures there is a level of diplomatic engagement going forward. When it comes to key risk considerations for businesses, a lot of the direct security threats that they face will be the same as the ones that NGOs will face, which I'll go into on the next slide. So for this section, I've focused a bit more on non-security risks to international businesses, but assume some of those will be transferable to NGO operations and vice versa. One of the most obvious hurdles is going to be the sort of potential compliant problems inherent in doing business with or providing finance to, I think, even for aid programs that need to be delivered wholly by the government or potentially by PPPs, to a government led by individuals who are subject to EU, US, UN sanctions. In Haqqani's case, he's also on the FBI's most wanted list. That image to the right is a very pared down version of the the cabinet, but you can see there are major ministerial positions there, as well as the Prime Minister's role, that are now occupied by internationally sanctioned people. So that's going to require a great deal of consideration, and it's still unclear how aid funding, for example, is going to be able to reach Afghanistan without violations. It's also, I think, very plausible that any foreign countries that do start to increase their footprint in Afghanistan will have to contend with reputational risks and physical targeting of projects and staff if they're involved in projects that aren't seen as benefiting Afghanistan or Afghan citizens as much as they benefit either foreign companies, foreign countries, or even the Taliban government. Sort of a possible parallel here, which Nat mentioned again, is the kind of targeting of Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects in Balochistan in Pakistan. The Baloch separatists have criticised those for being exploitative and providing limited benefits to locals relative to the benefits they provide the central government and Beijing, and that's prompted attacks on Chinese nationals as well as the developments themselves. There is a longer-standing sort of separatist anti-government agenda in that case, so it's not entirely the same scenario. But I think in Afghanistan, similar concerns will realistically be of concern, particularly where the extractive industries are concerned. I think it's been estimated that there are about $3 trillion of mineral deposits that haven't been tapped into in Afghanistan. So those are potentially going to be of interest to foreign investors with a fairly high risk appetite. But if those projects don't translate back into jobs and revenue for locals, that's liable to cause security and reputational issues. I think in the more immediate term, it's longer term as well. The scale and reliability of any international transport links is going to be a long-term consideration, but in the short term, it's certainly something that's causing problems. So for the time being, there is an air bridge in place that's being used by the World Food Programme, UN staff, technical advisors. And the first international flight since the takeover left Kabul this week for Qatar, which has been quite a key player in terms of restoring some level of service so far. But I think a workable arrangement is likely to rely for now on external security and external technical support, which was something that was under discussion with Turkey even before the US withdrawal finished. For the time being, at least, the level of operations that have been able to resume wouldn't be sufficient and wouldn't be reliable enough to guarantee that businesses could fully evacuate expat staff if the security deteriorated quickly again, or that they could bring in medical supplies or equipment for projects on any large scale. So I think this is something that businesses will need to continue assessing. Border access is also problematic at the moment. There are reports that there have been sort of major 80% slowdowns in border traffic at some of the key crossing points. So that's caused significant problems for traders and also kind of associated commodity shortages and price increases. It is likely that kind of problem will ease, but it will take time. And I think border crossings will still be subject to closures and delays, particularly if security deteriorates again and neighbouring countries become concerned about sort of increasing migrant inflows. This all feeds into the point that the business environment is going to be very unpredictable for at the very least the next 6 months, but I'd say most likely well beyond that. A lot will depend on the Taliban's governance, including how well it's able to manage setting up new governing structures. Potentially a lot of former government employees will be unable or unwilling to return to their positions, so that's going to cause a lot of logistical problems. Finally, then, looking at the sort of key risk considerations for NGOs, we are seeing some international staff and delegates beginning to return to the country now, which is being permitted. And the Taliban's provided some, for example, Gulf organisations with a list of requests and proposed ways of facilitating their work in the country. So it's clear that at the top level, there is still an understanding that allowing foreign NGOs to work in the country is, for one thing, beneficial, but for another, probably going to be really important in terms of unlocking access to finance in the future. Despite that, you can see from the graph to the right the wide range of recorded threats that aid workers have already been facing over the course of the US intervention. And there are still several actors that are going to continue to pose a very significant direct or indirect threat to NGOs. And some of these will be applicable to businesses more broadly. Chief among those, as far as direct targeting of foreigners is concerned, will be Islamic State. It will be looking to target Westerners, specifically foreign organisations, because it will be hoping to pick up support from Taliban hardliners who are frustrated with any suggestion of the Taliban taking a sort of lenient or permissive approach. As Nat mentioned, at the moment that threat is primarily concentrated in Nangarhar, but there will be a possibility that, given the sort of extent to which the Taliban security forces will now be stretched, it will have an opportunity to expand into more areas. And I think the increased presence of NGOs across a wider range of areas will also be something that IS can potentially capitalise on, because there will just be greater availability of potential targets. In terms of the Taliban, I think the primary direct deliberate threat at the moment will come more from the junior ranks ignoring higher level directives than from any higher level policies. As I said, the Taliban's got more control over more territory than it ever has done before. And although it did govern some of the areas that it's now in before the takeover, it's still going to be very stretched. And it's likely that there will be local variations in the extent to which particular laws are being enforced, which could well see some of these lower ranks carrying out sort of targeting that wouldn't necessarily be sanctioned at a higher level. The other main threat actor, again, I don't think will be a deliberate or widespread threat, but there is a potential for resistance fighters to sort of unintentionally affect NGO operations. There is likely to be an increase in sort of the presence of pockets of resistance, and if NGOs are operating in these areas because they are sort of by definition almost less stable than some other areas, there is a risk of them being caught up in this violence unintentionally. In terms of operational disruption, again, a lot of the problems here are the same ones that businesses will face, but slightly more pressing in NGOs' cases, given that the humanitarian needs mean they're not going to have the luxury of waiting to see when or if things stabilise or picking the most stable areas to operate in. On the ground, a particular problem as far as access is concerned is likely to be the way in which the Taliban handles those pockets of resistance when they spring up. So in Panjshir, for example, it's already responded to resistance there by blocking a number of major roads. That's meant that residents are facing substantial food shortages, to the point of starvation having been raised as a real concern in the last few days. It's likely that similar blockades will be imposed with very little notice elsewhere in the country to manage areas that are experiencing protests or putting up kind of concerted resistance. And frankly, at the moment, it's not clear whether the Taliban's likely to be willing to cooperate with aid staff and allow them to pass through checkpoints, or whether that's going to be problematic. But at the very least, it will stall aid delivery. I do think this is likely to become a bit clearer over the next few weeks as we see whether the Taliban government is willing to work with NGOs in the short term to reach an agreement over things like the terms of access and operations, and whether it's willing to cooperate on sort of establishing a mechanism for monitoring and responding to breaches. The last point to mention is the broad mental health implications of the takeover. I think not only for staff in the country, but also for those who might have been able to leave safely or might never have worked in Afghanistan directly, but who are now essentially at risk of seeing decades of work, particularly on issues like women's rights, absolutely undone. And colleagues and collaborators on the ground facing very real physical threats as well. So a lot of NGOs will already have systems in place to deal with this, given the environments that they operate in. But I think that will be something to be aware of and to provide support for. So just to summarise, Taliban will need international cooperation to make governing viable, and it's likely to receive that to an extent from a range of countries for various reasons, but it will be very patchy. most are still going to refuse to recognise it formally, and this means, particularly because of the sanctions of key government figures, that there are going to be substantial compliance risks, as well as the logistical and physical concerns which will continue to face both businesses and NGOs.